Welcome to the FI Newscast. I'm Susan Choi. In this episode, we'll be covering the latest in the big three commodities, coffee, cocoa, and orange juice, with commodities expert Judy Ganes. But first, let's cover the top stories for this week. We start with the latest in the M&A world. Burger King's parent company, Restaurant Brands International, Inc., plans to buy out its largest U.S. franchisee, Carrols Restaurant Group, for about $1 billion in cash. It's looking to complete the purchase in Q2 of fiscal year 2024. Carrols owns and operates more than 1,000 restaurants under the Burger King and Popeyes brands. Meanwhile, ongoing talks with government officials are further delaying the Kroger-Albertsons merger. The proposed $24.6 billion deal is now planning to close in the first half of Kroger's fiscal year 2024 instead of early this year. The merger plan has seen much opposition from various U.S. lawmakers due to antitrust concerns. And some M&A action going on in the plant-based world as well, as plant-based chain Next Level Burger acquired 𝗏𝗏𝘁. This news comes after Next Level received $20 million in a recent funding round in 2022. But what implications does this move have on the markets? For more insights, check out our focus article at foodinstitute.com. Some big business moves in agriculture as John Deere announces a new partnership. The famous farm machinery maker will start equipping their products with Elon Musk's Starlink satellite service across the US and Brazil. It's part of an effort to connect farmers with high-speed internet and develop precise agriculture techniques. The initiative is expected to start later this year. Apparently, John Deere tested satellites for about 8 months before deciding to go with Starlink. When it comes to coupons, shoppers want them to be universal. That's according to Kroger's data firm, 𝗏𝐴4.51°, which found that 71% of shoppers wanted universal coupons across a variety of retailers. The report also found that 70% of consumers want auto-loaded digital coupons, and 52% want free grocery delivery in the future. In marketing news, White Castle is back at it again for Valentine's Day. In honor of the holiday of love, the burger maker will host its annual Valentine's Day dinner. It's a tradition that's been happening since 1991. Customers can reserve a table on opentable.com for a dining experience consisting of hostess seating, tableside service, and decorative table design celebrating this special day. This idea reminds us at the Food Institute of similar marketing campaigns, such as Shake Shack's Truffle Menu Fine Dining event in early 2023, and Australia's Nell restaurant doing an 11-course tasting menu in 2022 based on KFC's 11 herbs and spices. Will fast food fine dining become a trend? We'll be on the lookout. And CES 2024 may have ended, but our coverage didn't. Don't forget to check out our interviews and footage on our social media websites. That includes LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. We are still editing all the footage we have, so stay tuned for new videos we are putting out every week. Coffee, cocoa, and orange juice. These are arguably some of the most important commodities in the world. But what's going on with the commodities these days? What's the state of the industry of these products? To give us some insights on this, we have with us now Judy Ganes, president of J Ganes Consulting. She is a commodities expert with 40 years of experience. Judy, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Let's get right into it. Let's talk cocoa. We know we've been seeing, the struggles that the food industry has been having, due to the economy, the financial situation. Let's get into raw materials. What's going on with cocoa? What are you seeing, Judy, out there?
Well, right now, cocoa prices are the highest they've been since the late 1970s. And at that time, there were some production problems, but you didn't have some of the dynamics that the market is facing right now. So some of the key differences, and what has me concerned about it, is that you have consolidation in who the major cocoa producing countries are. So the Ivory Coast and Ghana, the top two producers, now account for about 70% of world cocoa output. And so when you have production threatened in one of those countries that by far outweighs total of all other countries, then you have a problem. And the second point is that before you could say, okay, well, the Ivory Coast might have had a production issue because of weather. And then they could also, if there was a disease issue, just replant, expand the area in the Ivory Coast when prices are high. That's what you'd naturally expect. But where are they expanding the production? That's in forested areas, in mountainsides, and that is no longer permitted. So there's an issue right now in the Ivory Coast where, yes, we had some wet weather, too much rain earlier in the year, but there's also a lot of proliferation of disease. And that is the biggest threat to cocoa production right now. And there's no cure for swollen shoot disease. And so the only way to get rid of it is to actually eradicate trees. So it's very different than if you have a disease problem in soybeans or corn, and then you could just idle the land for a little while and then bring it back and throw the soil. When it's a tree, you have to wait, several years before you could replant that tree and use that land again. And it's another 2 years before that tree is going to produce. So we're looking at knocking out production for 5 years. If a farmer is going to reinvest that money, and do they have that money to do so? So we have a serious problem as far as the forthcoming supply for cocoa, like I've never seen before. You could always sort of say, well, what would happen? But price is usually the best cure for it. In this case, the length of time to cure it is the problem.
From what you're seeing, I mean, what does this mean for companies that need cocoa to make their products?
Well, there's another wrinkle to this, and that is that over the years, to have value addition to the cocoa beans, which obviously is the first stop in the supply chain, and therefore the prices are fairly low. So the Ivory Coast has pushed to increase the grinding of those beans and create value add where they sell the products, the cocoa butter and the cocoa powder, to manufacturers. So the production of these key byproducts that are used for making chocolate is now pushed away from the consumer side to the producing country. And the Ivory Coast is the world's largest grinder of beans, not only the producer. And so now we're the manufacturers who are relying on cocoa butter and cocoa powder from the Ivory Coast going to get that supply. And so some of the manufacturing process has disappeared in consuming countries because they've just been relying more and more on buying the product from the producing country. It's complicated, very, very complex.
To say the least. Judy, what about the impact that we're seeing now on companies?
I mean, there's certain trends. First off, there was very high sugar prices, and there still are reasonably high. And so manufacturers are faced with two key ingredients in the manufacture of chocolate. And then freight costs were very high. And so they had raised their prices 2 years ago. And they buy forward usually over a year's supply. So their replacement costs are what's the problem. So consumers saw a price increase go through already, but there's going to be more price increases coming along. And price increases can come along from shrinkflation, changing the packaging, putting thinner coatings, putting fewer chocolate chips in a cookie, or putting a thinner coating, or using 𝗂𝐼𝐵 and cheapening the product. So you have less cocoa mass in some of the cookies and cakes and pastries. So you'd have degradation in the quality to help keep margins in line.
Right. We'll have to see how the consumers react to that. All right, let's move on to coffee. What everyone's been talking about, prices have been going up on coffee beverages. Judy, what are we seeing, in terms of, in the commodities, context of coffee? What's going on there?
So in coffee, Brazil is the largest coffee producing country. And Brazil had, during the pandemic, a drought that ruined production. Then they had 3 frosts in 1 year that knocked out the following year's production. And then they had more drought. And all hope was pinned on the crop recovering in a very strong way for the crop that's developing on the trees right now. So you had ideal weather for most of this past year, and the vegetative growth on the trees was fabulous. The trees were recovering from the drought, they were recovering from the frost, and the expectation was that you could have a very large bumper crop and be able to replace inventory that had been drawn down as a result. And suddenly in November, the weather turned in Brazil. And you had record heat for several days. And it was borderline as to how the tree was going to respond to this unusual weather. The growth, as I said, everything was excellent prior to that. And then it takes time to see the reaction. And there was some dry weather, but it was really the high heat. And the tree became very stressed and started shedding some of this bumper crop. It still could be a large crop, but not the mega crop that was anticipated by the market. And that has helped to lift coffee prices once again.
Got it. Got it. So, so what are we expecting to see? What do you think we're going to expect to see in 2024 as it trickles down into, people buying their coffee?
Well, consumers aren't going to feel it that much. I mean, the amount of the price increase right now, what unfortunately happens is similar to what I said with the cocoa market, and manufacturers take action. So roasters have learned to utilize, some commercial roasters, not all, obviously, lower quality beans. And if they can't get the Brazilians, then they're looking at acquiring other beans as substitutes, and maybe they're not going to buy the priciest coffee. So they make do. Or you're looking at sometimes fillers. So chicory, becomes a popular flavor. Why? Because it's an addition and it stretches the supply.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, Judy, moving on to orange juice. Let's see what's going on there. I know from, our research at the Food Institute on the sales side, consumers in general, orange juice as a beverage, they've kind of been moving away from it, as there are constantly new functional beverages, different types of beverages being put on the market. But what are we seeing, again, from the commodities context when it comes to orange juice? What's going with the orange crops? Give us your insights.
First, let me back up for a second. What I find astounding is that consumers have no problem buying some sugar-laden coffee beverage and not considering the calorie count. And then on a glass of wholesome natural orange juice, sugar is like out of sight and it's taboo and we can't drink it because the calories are high. And so that equation doesn't quite match up. And it's, unfortunate for the citrus industry and manufacturers that consumers have become so micro-focused on the sugar content, calories in a glass of orange juice, ignoring all the vitamin content and everything else, and the good for you properties compared to some of these other drinks that they just guzzle down in oversized beverages.
Right, right. I mean that's a good point. That makes sense. Judy, so what are we seeing? From where you stand, how is orange juice doing? I think you mentioned in conversations, as you said, with the cocoa crops, there's a bad disease. Is that happening as well with the orange crops as too?
Oh, unbelievably so. So to put it into perspective, Florida produced 242 million boxes of oranges less than 2 decades ago. And production is now 15.5 million boxes. A box weighs 90 pounds. So we've had certainly hurricanes and we've had frosts, We've had dry weather. You could come up with all the excuses, land development in Florida that has taken away from production. But it's the number one problem is disease, citrus greening. And there really isn't a cure. And researchers have been trying to find ways to combat it, to slow it. There's been some hopes that they've made some breakthroughs, but nothing definitive yet. And so it's been this race against the clock where Florida orange production has been going lower and lower and lower. That has forced prices to go higher and higher and higher. And so not only are consumers turning away from drinking orange juice because of the factors that I mentioned, but then add to it that suddenly it becomes a super expensive beverage. It has not been a winning combination.
Right, got it. So Judy, from your perspective, with things like disease trees to weather patterns affecting crops, thus producing really high prices and continually rising prices of these raw materials, of these commodities. What would you say to the audience out there that's watching? Their various retailers, restaurateurs, they rely on these types of materials to produce their goods, to do their business. What would you say is the number one thing they need to look out for for 2024, as we're anticipating continually rising prices?
Well, I think one thing is understanding, and that it's not a situation where you could say, oh, they're just gouging us and they're raising our prices because they feel like it and they haven't brought the prices down, and they blame it on labor and rent and all these other transportation issues. In the cases of these commodities, there is an actual problem that has warranted the higher prices and for that to be passed on to consumers. I mean, the margins that producers are making is very, very thin. So they're not getting the full benefit. Their costs have gone up tremendously. Supplies have through the value chain, costs have gone up tremendously. And so, consumers are going to have to adjust to it, or they're going to change their their behavior.
Yep, very well said. All right, Judy Ganes, president of J Ganes Consulting. Judy, thanks again for joining us.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, always.
And as always, you can check out all the great content that we've done by clicking on this playlist. Till next time, I'm Susan Choi. Take care and have a great weekend.